Alright guys, so I think we can all agree that full battles are often one of the peaks of the Pokemon anime, right? At least in terms of battles, these types are basically the only ones to be at the top of the rankings. And I bet you if someone posted one of their favorite moments from the whole anime, they'll pull out a scene straight from a full battle. Anyways, the reason I bring this up is because with full battles with lots of memorable segments, I think to myself, what was the best and worst part of it? And seeing as I love to do rankings every once in a while, I thought I'd auto rank each and every 1v1 Pokemon matchup within a battle. Weird, I know. With today, it will cover all the ones with Ash versus Paul during the Sinnoh League. And to clear out any possible case of misunderstanding before we start, I'm not going to count any sweeps that take place as one singular matchup. They'll all be split and ranked accordingly, whether that's for better or for worse. This also applies to when there's a Pokemon that requires multiple switches from the opposing side before going down. But to not get too literal here, we aren't going to count a matchup if neither Pokemon have fought each other before getting switched out. That sounds weird, but that does indeed happen rarely. So to summarize the criteria, it's every and only the matchups where we see the Pokemon going at it 1v1 in any real capacity, be it big or small. But that should cover the rules, so without stalling any longer, let's get started.
Pokemon! Stand by!
Starting off with the worst ever clash within Ash vs Paul, I have Tortira versus Dropion. Now, there's two outcomes that usually come from this matchup. Dropion being a disgusting creature that managed to clear 3 of Ash's Pokemon in a row, and Tortira's last battle being another defeat, solidifying that 100% loss rate after fully evolving. It's so wild because these two were going at it for a little bit, and then we had Tortira restoring their energy, clearly cooking up for a second phase. And then the battle ends. What made this kind of buns is the fact that Tortira wasn't even that banged up, and it wasn't even interrupted mid-recovery too. This is bro getting one-tapped after possibly reaching 80-90% HP max. And for Tortira, this was unexpectedly the saddest way to go out because bro had the worst experience fighting Paul more than anyone on the Sinnoh team. He's the first to allow Paul to get his first win against Ash, was getting friendly fired in a tag battle with Paul, gets a humiliating evolution while against him, fails the run back against that same Pokemon later, and then finally this. Like, Dropion's dominance is a large part in what makes this battle good and memorable, but this resulting in Tortira getting one of the sorriest conclusions out of Ash's Pokemon doesn't sell me on it as much as I want to. But then after this is Glidecore versus Ninjask. Imagine you come back from a training arc, half your team gets washed, you come out and then you're also getting washed. And then you're forced to retreat. I'm not gonna lie to you, this matchup almost killed Glidecore's momentum after returning, and don't get me wrong, the way Ninjask battles is actually interesting and somewhat underrated, and it makes me wish we got to see it more often. Plus, they needed someone to be the practice dummy to show it off, of course, but I think this was a situation where Ninjask just doesn't have enough room to fit in to make it work without making someone else look sort of bad. And there's not really much else to say on this. It's short, it doesn't last long, but the fact that the supposed wild card on Ash's side was getting washed before it could do anything takes me out of the immersion. And to follow up on this is also a Ninjask matchup, which is against Infernape. This one might be the first odd take, maybe for how it does have big things going for it, the underground Flare Blitz being a top tier strat, and Infernape using high concentration to take out something faster in itself are both cool stuff. But the biggest flaw about this clash is both how and why Ninjask gets beaten, because while the underground Flare Blitz was great, they do a weird thing where Ninjask gets caught up in the move to where it takes notable damage and cancels out the speed boost ability. To me, that felt like a load of bull, as the underground Flare Blitz targeted purpose was to nullify toxic spikes specifically. Like, think about that again. Dude literally gets severely hurt from the excess heat coming from below the earth while in the air. And it gets even more crazy because when looking at Ninjask in that scene, it looks like they dodged it, or at least took a little bit of damage and backed away before it got worse. Overall, this kills the hype for Ninjask because other than its usage being cool, I personally found it interesting as a pole Pokemon for how we knew he had it but never got to see it in action. However, this is kind of like how I said before, with there not being enough room for Ninjask to work well in the overall battle. battle. Whether it's winning or losing, it just feels like a lose-lose situation regardless. You know how people bring up how Paul possibly could have won if he used his more iconic Pokemon instead of newer and random ones? Yeah, Ninjask is one of the main reasons why. Then following up on this is Pikachu versus Aggron, and at this point we've hit the matchups that I think are alright, and that perfectly encapsulates what I think about this matchup because it's not bad, not good, just okay. Like, it definitely was going hard in the beginning with Aggron having control and then Pikachu reversing that momentum, but then Aggron stops those momentums and forces Pikachu to return, essentially killing the hype while it was getting good. With Pikachu having much more memorable fights later in this battle, plus Aggron having no scars to show, this clash just ends up getting lost in a realm of forgettability. Not bad, just unmemorable. And after this, we have Weasel versus Dropion, and this is basically what I'd call a better version of the Tortira battle. Not only were both sides going at it pretty hard, especially Weasel, but Dropion shows how much of a menace he will become very well. But once the toxic spikes were set up, this clash just ends. Like, quite literally. Mind you, this was Weasel's chance to fight a real challenge since Gastradon was supposed to be one of the quote-unquote freebies in Paul's team. So this loss being his last ever push after what was essentially a pretty lackluster showing in the long last stretches of the series kind of blows. In defense of this clash though, compared to let's say the Tortira version, the negatives are far less bad and the positives are somewhat higher. Granted, with the very sudden conclusion, it still doesn't leave much words with me. And then beating Weasel versus Dropion by just a smidge is Weasel versus Gastradon. A good chunk of my opinion on this is just like what I said earlier with how I don't think Weasel broke free of the mediocrity that was within the last 80 or something episodes of Diamond and Pearl. To clarify, within that time frame, I believe his only notable wins were against Mr. Mime in the episode he learns Ice Punch and this year Gastradon. In defense of this matchup though, what I really liked, which I initially wouldn't have been a fan of, was how easily Gastradon gets taken out. Because while the quick KOs of both it and Aggron would normally be trash, I had to remember these were the ones that were willing to go down in the overall battle before the rest of Paul's team. So seeing these two getting taken out pretty quickly made sense. They were quite literally doing their job and succeeded. Weasel using its signature Ice Aqua Jet and his Ice Punch getting real payoff is one of the best moments in his career. If it wasn't for Gastradon being a little bit on the sandbag side, I would definitely put this a few spots up. And then after this is Infernape versus Aggron, and this is a very wishy-washy matchup for its quality. Like, sometimes it's pretty whatever, sometimes it's pretty gas, but today it's somewhere in the middle. For one, just like with Gastradon, Aggron is also supposed to be one of the sandbags in the team, so they can't be too bad or too good. But again, similar to Gastradon, they did its job in forcing Ash to reveal his team, which I can't really hate on. And as you might tell, this is becoming kind of a running trend with all these short matchups in the battle where I really don't have too much to say in comparison. Aggron's lifespan came and went in this battle, so the memorability does hurt it in both of its instances. Though next up is Starraptor versus Gastradon, and here are the clashes I say I definitely like. What's cool about this is that it has a lot of good content to work here. Firstly, finding out that Paul can also use Counter Shield, then the whole falling water pulse entrapment, then Starraptor using close combat to get out of there, and then finally Paul anticipating that in his back pocket and then had a plan B prepped. This is the best out of the unfinished clashes in my opinion, for how again, there's just a lot of good content to work with. Like, I'd say the whole exchange was one of the more memorable out of the entire list. It drags down a bit for how much Starraptor was getting folded from what we eventually know later were the weak links of the team, but the lid reveal that Starraptor seemingly recovered like nothing happened mostly negates that flaw. And while we're at it, the next one also has to do with Starraptor, which is the matchup against Dropion. You don't think much on this on a surface level, but it's actually weird how well placed this matchup was. Obviously, with the whole toxic spikes and Weasel getting wiped instantly, the first thing Ash does is bring out a flying type. Cool, smart, but even still, Paul's skill gaps so hard that it doesn't even matter. And this is where I think Dropion's 3-mon sweep peaks, because they take out what was essentially Ash's only quote-unquote countermeasure, and now it has you thinking, hold on, wait. This Dropion might be different on a first watch through. The one thing that puts it a little lower compared to the next one is just how quick it is. I know quite a few of these were quick, but this one was like certainly a blink and you'll miss it kind of thing. And right after, we have Electivire versus Glidecore, and unlike the other matchups listed prior, this one's quality is heavily Paul carried. The score is 1-3, and most people probably expected an Electivire versus Infernape matchup by the end of the battle, so it was interesting to see how we'd get here. And they did not disappoint because they start off by making Bro a demon. Electivire was up against the worst possible opponent due to the typing, but Paul shows why he's so big-brained by copying Ash's underground move strat to attack Glidecore. And even when Glidecore tries fighting back, he just gets swatted down like a bug, and it's like, whoa. It's even more nuts when Electivire just outright blocks a Giga Impact head-on without using any moves, despite literally knowing Protect. Normally, I'd think wrecking Glidecore after being gone to train for so many episodes would be a bad thing, but at this point in the battle, that training has already been paid off in full. Electivire is the final boss of the battle, so it makes sense Glidecore was gonna get power clipped right after. What I liked with how Electivire was handled is how strong they made it, because they've been building them up to be Paul's next main guy for a long time, but we don't really see much of that throughout the series to be sold on it. So the Sinnoh League being where that finally paid off was just great to see. To be honest, this is one of the more flawless matchups in the entire list, but the reason it's not ranked much higher is that it's short and simple. It's more so trying to quickly write Glidecore off the battle than a serious 1v1 matchup, but that's okay. It did its job. And so after this is the literal matchup prior, which is Glidecore versus Dropion. I feel for a lot of people, this would be the easy number 2, and I can definitely see why. We have the animation looking saucy, the ending shot being one of the best in the anime, to be honest, and more importantly, Glidecore closing off what was one of the best redemption arcs. The one thing that doesn't want me to put it that much higher is just how the battle ends, or more particularly the rest of the battle after that specific ending shot. Because of how things looked when it was playing out, you'd think Glidecore's X-Scissor would overcome Dropion's pin missile, but then when you click to watch the next episode and then you see what happens next, you see Glidecore end up getting rocked, and it's like, okay. Not only did it kind of just feel anticlimactic, but they just do something similar right after with Cross Poison versus Fire Fang. This time, Glidecore lands the hit and it seals the deal, but it really just felt like the first attempt was some sort of like blooper or whatever, and they just had to redo the scene again. This time using cooler moves to make the finisher look better. Although in heavy defense of this matchup, that's my only complaint. Just that part 2 and part 3 just had an awkward transition. Don't let that take away from how monumental of a dub this was for Glidecore, because I'm serious when I say brother needed this. Glidecore is one of the few Ash Pokemon I don't dunk on regarding its win rate, because majority of their losses has been against opponents he's not meant to win. So when he disappears, trains, and comes back, he's given the opportunity to not only finish the Fallen, but also give Paul the Slip. That feat alone, along with the very good visuals, definitely makes this one of the standout moments in this battle. But coming in for the bronze medal, this might have you surprised it got this far, and that is Pikachu versus Frostlass. Now, I don't know how well or disliked this matchup is compared to some of the others, so I won't say it's underrated per se, but I'll definitely go ahead and say this matchup is slept on. Because for me, up until this point in the show, there weren't really a lot of good Pikachu matchups, you know? Frostlass is often forgot about when it comes to Paul's Pokemon, but unlike Ninjask, I think the performance here wasn't a waste. And so to talk about some good things about it, I like how the hail setting it starts off with takes you, the audience, out of the experience of what was shown before, but in a good way. Seeing how Snowcloak activates under the hail immerses you into what Ash could do and how he'll do it. But what was so cool other than the immersion was just the power difference between the two Pokemon. While Frostlass got taken out in 2 shots, all the damage she did was enough for Pikachu to justifiably be worn out by the next time he fights. Furthermore, based on what Pikachu does in his next matchup, followed up by Paul's reaction during this one, it makes Pikachu look good out of this because he's simply built different. Had it been the other members of the Sinnoh team outside of Infernape, it's very likely they'd have lost, or at least won with very high difficulty at the very least. So in short, this matchup does a great job at making both sides look strong here. And to be honest, this matchup overall can kind of be weird because I wouldn't point it out as one of the more memorable matchups in League history, but when you sit down and watch it in full, you instantly remember how good it is. And then coming in at number 2 is Pikachu versus Electivire, which is so gas for a multitude of reasons. One of which is again the Frostlass matchup. They just make Pikachu look built different. While Gliscor was getting pieced up by the Underground Thunder, this matchup opens up with Pikachu speed blitzing that exact same attack and absolutely trucking Electivire with a simple quick attack. Not to mention when the two clashed head on, both Ash and Paul collectively thought both Pokemon were equally matched in physical strength, which was just insane. There's even the little stuff like how Pikachu might have been the only one to break out of Electivire's tail if I remember correctly, and Brock saying that Paul will still have trouble beating Pikachu despite the latter being much more beaten and tired. Even though Pikachu was most certainly gonna lose this, all these feats together hype him up so well. Outside of this and 2 other examples on the top of my head, I feel when in general when someone else on Ash's team is set to win, Pikachu losses bounce back and forth between bad or even just boring. So I'm glad they went this route. And while I'm here, I know there's usually one critique with this matchup some people complain about here and there, and that's Ash giving Paul a free motor drive charge. Now, see, I don't have a problem with this because Pikachu, while despite being seemingly equal to Electivire, was slightly on the losing end. And ignoring the fact that Ash didn't know that last clash between the two was a reenactment of their first battle, I'd say this was relatively a good play. You could argue Ash could have just used Infernape first to see what would have happened before he had to go through such measures, but come on, be real. That would have been the much weaker outcome in comparison. Plus, Ash does what he does believing in his Pokemon, which is obvious, but if he thought he could take out Electivire without Infernape, just let him ball, man. Although that's essentially my 2 cents on what would be the only quote-unquote fathomable issue with this battle. But lastly, this matchup was also investing due to Pikachu and Electivire's rivalry. Most people forget this was a thing due to Infernape, but this actually was a thing in early Diamond and Pearl. However, it was short-lived as their beef was pretty much resolved not long after Chimchar joined Ash. But I feel like the prior history these two had together is what also makes this matchup so great. And even now, I'd love to see a rematch with these two at full health and see how that go. But to move on, obviously the best 1v1 matchup in this battle was Infernape versus Electivire. I don't want to title this matchup with a generic, the greatest get back of all time, the ultimate revenge story, the all-time clutch of the century, because that's not really what it was. Chimchar, Blaze, his power with or without it, all of those things were pretty much what that story was all about. But one thing they most absolutely cooked with was making Infernape and Electivire specifically the last one standing, because this final matchup was supposed to be the whole similar goals but different paths bit finally coming together. Not that it's automatically a bad thing, but a lot of other popular final showdowns in the anime definitely lack in the narrative dynamics department, which makes this just look oh so good in comparison. But to the actual battle portion, it was peak. From the hand-to-hand combat between Thunder Punch and Mach Punch, to the roundabout ways of both sides avoiding getting hit by each other's moves. Infernape also just has a pretty underrated feat for matching Electivire with a motor drive boost for a little while, considering Pikachu was barely able to react. And actually, speaking of Electivire, there's such an underrated factor in this matchup when you rewatch this enough times. Seeing it have a very defensive fighting style makes them stand very much apart from the other major ace-like Pokemon, which are admittedly goo goo gaga, their offense is off the roof, whatever. And then the finale with Blaze activated is peak once again. For those that haven't, I highly recommend seeing the original sub for this battle. I won't elaborate just on how much there would be to explain, just check it out whenever you get the free time, however you can find it. It's an iconic experience. Of course, this is just one of the best matchups in anime period, but to keep things on topic, it's undoubtedly the best matchup that could have possibly happened in this battle. I think I speak for everyone when I say Ash vs. Paul in the Sinnoh League would not even be Ash vs. Paul in the Sinnoh League if it wasn't for Infernape versus Electivire. From the narrative to the action, it has it all. But that is the entire ranking. Not gonna lie, it does feel weird to break down and nitpick a lot of aspects for what is essentially my favorite battle in the entire anime, but don't take it too serious. At the end of the day, a battle is only as good as the sum of its parts. Feel free to share what you thought was the worst matchup, or even was just like an underrated one, or even your favorite one, whatever you feel like. This topic was a way to kind of branch out into doing something something new, throwing random stuff at the wall and kind of seeing what sticks. While I love doing team building, I also want to just kind of see what other topics click well. So if this pops off well, I don't mind doing another big full battle in the show, maybe against Gary, Sawyer, whatever. But essentially, that's all that's left else to say. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got for now. Yep.